The lamp on Daniel's desk had been off for 2 hours, and he hadn't moved to fix that. He sat on the floor with his back against the couch, knees pulled up. The takeout bag from 3 days ago still on the coffee table because throwing it away would mean standing up, and standing up would mean deciding something about the evening. And he hadn't gotten there yet. The city outside the window made its usual sounds, a cab horn, someone's music 2 floors down, the particular hiss of wet leaves against the sidewalk that only happened in October, and he let it wash over him, the way he let most things wash over him on this specific night of the year. He wasn't thinking about Marcus. He was very carefully not thinking about Marcus, which was its own kind of thinking, a constant low-level effort that left him tired in a way sleep never fixed. The window opened. Not the front door, which had a deadbolt and a chain and a secondary lock he'd installed himself after a bad week 2 winters ago. The window, the one that faced the shared fire escape, the one he kept unlocked because the latch was broken, and he'd been meaning to call the super for approximately 4 months. It slid up with a sound like a slow exhale, and then there were hands on the sill, and then a person was climbing into his apartment with the focused, methodical energy of someone parallel parking in a tight spot. She landed on the hardwood and straightened up and looked at him sitting on the floor in the dark. And she didn't scream or apologize or explain herself. She just held up the paper bag in her left hand white, grease spotted, the logo of the Thai place on Clement Street printed in red and said, "I got the green curry. I hope that's okay." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. He knew her the way you knew someone who lived 12 feet away through a shared wall. Her name was Maya. She coordinated events for a living. She had an opinion about coffee that she expressed loudly and often, and she had never, in the 8 months they'd been neighbors, climbed through his window before. "How did you get onto the fire escape?" he said. "My side." She was already setting the bag on the coffee table, moving the old takeout to the floor with the calm efficiency of someone who had assessed the situation and decided the old takeout was not the current problem. "You have to go through the window in my kitchen. It's a little awkward with the radiator, but manageable." She looked around, found the floor lamp in the corner, and made a motion toward it. "Should I leave it?" he said. She left it. She sat down on the floor across from him, cross-legged, and opened the paper bag and took out 2 containers and 2 sets of plastic utensils wrapped in paper napkins. She handed him one set without asking. "Green curry. Pad see ew," she said, setting the containers between them like offerings. "I didn't know which one you'd want, so I got both. The curry's better, but the noodles travel better. Your call." Daniel looked at the containers. He looked at her. She had paint on her left forearm, a smear of something burnt orange, and her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it quickly. And she was waiting with the patience of someone who had already decided not to be in a hurry. "Why are you in my apartment?" he said. "You'll see," she said, and picked up the pad, CEOU. He didn't know what to do with that. He had, in 34 years of life, developed fairly robust frameworks for most social situations, but none of them covered a neighbor appearing through a window with Thai food and an answer that wasn't an answer. He looked at the curry container. He picked it up. "This is a strange thing to do," he said. "Probably," she agreed. She had already opened her container and was looking at the noodles with the critical expression of someone conducting a professional evaluation. They skimped on the basil. "Maya, I'm asking you a genuine question." She looked up at him. Her eyes were the kind of dark that took a moment to resolve in low light. And there was something in her expression that wasn't evasion exactly. It was more like she was waiting for him to hear something he hadn't asked yet. "I know," she said. "Eat first." He didn't know why he listened, but he opened the curry and ate. It was good. The Thai place on Clement was always good, and eating meant he didn't have to decide anything else for a few minutes, which turned out to be what he needed. The apartment was dark except for the city light coming through the window, orange-gray and diffuse, the kind of light that softened everything. Maya ate her noodles without talking. which he appreciated more than he expected to. At some point his shoulders came down from around his ears. He didn't notice it happen. "You have a lot of books," she said. Eventually, "Yes. I can see the spines from my window when the light's good. You've got the whole shelf by the fire escape window." She tilted her head toward it. "I tried to read them once. Got through 3 titles before the angle was too bad." "Which 3? The one with the red spine on the second shelf. Something about cartography. One with gold letters I couldn't quite make out. And the blue one at the end that's shelved backwards for some reason." He knew which one that was. He'd shelved it that way on purpose. 3 years ago, because he'd been unable to look at the cover and unable to throw it away. And backwards was a compromise. "That one's not shelved wrong," he said. "I just don't want to see the front." Maya didn't ask why. She glanced at the shelf. Briefly, and he saw her eyes land on the spot near the middle, where a small wooden-framed photograph sat with its face pressed against the shelf, looking at nothing, showing nothing. She looked at it for exactly 1 second, and then looked back at her food. She didn't ask about that either. He wasn't sure if he was grateful or unsettled. "How's the curry?" she asked. "Good," he said. "They didn't skimp on the basil." She pointed her fork at him. "Because I specifically said basil on the side." "You're welcome. I didn't ask you to." "I know. Eat the basil." She had already found the small paper cup of extra herbs tucked in the bottom of the bag and was sliding it across the floor to him. He took it. He ate the basil. Outside, the rain that had been threatening all evening finally arrived, tapping at the window glass with the polite insistence of something that had been patient long enough. They stayed on the floor until the food was gone. Maya collected the containers with the same quiet efficiency she'd used to clear the coffee table, folded everything neatly into the bag, and stood. Daniel stayed where he was and watched her move through his apartment in the dark around the coffee table, past the desk, back to the window with the ease of someone who was comfortable in spaces that weren't hers. "You don't have to go," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. She paused with her hand on the windowsill and looked back at him. The city light caught the edge of her face. "I know," she said, "but you're okay now." He wanted to tell her that wasn't the word he'd use. He wanted to ask her again what she'd meant by "you'll see," what she'd come to show him, what had moved her to climb a fire escape in October with 2 containers of Thai food for a neighbor she barely knew. He wanted to be logical about this, which was what he did with most things, disassemble them, find the mechanism, understand the function. But she was already at the window, swinging one leg over the sill with the same careful efficiency as before. And he let her go. He sat in the dark for a while longer after she'd gone. He wasn't not thinking about Marcus anymore. He was thinking about the photograph on the shelf that someone had noticed and not asked about, and somehow that it was easier to hold than what he'd been carrying before she'd come through the window. He didn't know why. The next morning he woke up earlier than usual, which happened sometimes when his sleep had been dreamless, not restful exactly, but uninterrupted in a way that felt like his body had decided to skip ahead. He lay in bed for a few minutes looking at the ceiling, which was the same ceiling it had always been, and then he got up and went to the kitchen and stood at the window with the broken latch. The fire escape was dry. The rain from the night before had cleared out and left the kind of October morning that was almost aggressively clear the sky, a particular shade of cold blue, the light coming in at an angle that made everything precise and slightly unfamiliar, the way your own apartment looked after you'd been away for a week and came back to it. He stood there with his coffee and looked at the short distance between his window and Maya's and thought, with the methodical patience he applied to editorial problems, that the distance was not very far at all. He didn't understand yet what that meant. He was still in the part of the story where the mechanism was visible but the function wasn't. What he understood was smaller and more immediate, that for the first time in 3 Octobers, he had eaten dinner on October 9th with another person in the room, that the dinner had been chosen for him, the curry, the basil on the side, the specific knowledge of what he might want by someone operating on information he hadn't given her, that she had sat on the floor in the dark without making she just sat in it. With him. Until it was something else. He looked at the photograph on the shelf. He looked at the lamp. Still on from the night before. Burning with the mild persistence of something left running that hadn't burned out. He was not, he realized, dreading the rest of the day. This was notable. October usually had a particular quality of dread to it, not acute, not dramatic. Just the low, persistent weight of a day that meant something he hadn't chosen for it to mean. Today felt like a day that had something still to happen in it, which was different from a day you were only trying to get through. He drank his coffee and watched the morning light move across the fire escape and noticed that Maya's window was already open 6 inches, and that there was a spider plant on her radiator that he hadn't known the name of until last night, and that knowing its name made a difference he couldn't quite account for. The photograph stayed on the shelf, face down, and that was still what it was, but it felt, incrementally, like a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. He suspected he knew whose fault that was. At some point he got up and turned on the lamp. The window protocol, as Daniel came to think of it, was never formally agreed upon. It simply established itself, the way certain things between neighbors do slowly, through repetition, until one morning you realize you've been leaving the latch up for 3 weeks and you can't remember deciding to do that. He noticed his window was open by default on a Tuesday, standing at the kitchen counter with his first cup of coffee, looking at the gray November sky going pale at the edges. He noticed it again on Thursday when he came home from the office and found it exactly as he'd left it, 6 inches. The gap he'd settled on. Enough for air but not rain. And he noticed, on Friday morning, that Maya's window was open too, the one directly across the small gap of the fire escape, her kitchen window with the radiator underneath that she'd mentioned. He could see the radiator from here. It had a spider plant on it that was doing extremely well. "Your basil situation," she said. From the other side of the gap, she was at her own counter, coffee in hand, looking at his windowsill. She'd appeared there the way she seemed to appear everywhere without announcement, already in the middle of something. He looked at his windowsill. He'd put a small pot of basil there approximately 3 days ago. He had told himself this was about cooking. "What about it?" he said. "It needs more sun than that spot gets." She squinted at it with the expression of someone rendering a professional verdict. "You should move it to the left side. The morning light hits different over there." "The morning light hits different," he repeated. "Don't do that voice. I'm trying to help your herb." "My herb is fine. Your herb is yellowing at the second leaf from the bottom. I can see it from here." She pointed with her coffee mug. He leaned forward and squinted at the basil. He moved the pot 6 inches to the left. "Better," she said, with the certainty of someone who had been right and knew it. This was how the mornings began to work. He'd be at the counter. She'd appear at hers. And there would be some exchange, her coffee versus his, which was a reliable source of minor conflict since she used a pour-over method and he used a machine, and she had opinions about this that she delivered without drama but at full conviction. "The machine makes it too hot," she said one morning. "You're cooking the grounds. The grounds survive," he said. "You don't know that," she said. "You're not the grounds." He started looking forward to the mornings in a way he hadn't looked forward to mornings in a while. His colleague Priya noticed something on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the window incident, when Daniel arrived at the office on time for once and without the particular flatness in his expression that she had, apparently, been tracking. She leaned across her desk and looked at him the way she sometimes looked at manuscripts carefully, with an eye for things that didn't fit. "You look less dead than usual," she said. "What happened?" "Nothing happened," he said, opening his laptop. "Something happened. You're in before 11. You got coffee that isn't the corner cart stuff." She pointed at his cup. He was using the pour-over method. He had not told anyone he was using the pour-over method. "That's a whole different kind of coffee. You never make that kind of effort." "People change," he said. "Not in November. November is when people revert. She studied him a moment longer, then let it go in the way Priya always eventually let things go, not dropping it, just filing it somewhere, to be returned to later when the evidence was stronger. The Harmon manuscript is on your desk. It's a disaster. It's always a disaster in the second act, he said. That's where the real work is. He meant it, which was something caring about a second act again, finding it interesting rather than just present. The thing about Daniel was that he was good at his work and moderately terrible at most other things, which was a configuration he'd arrived at gradually and mostly through attrition. After Marcus died 3 years ago, October 9th, a blood clot that no one had seen coming. Fast and without drama in a way that felt like a personal insult, Daniel had quietly rearranged his life around what remained. The apartment was clean and organized. The job was stable. He read widely and well. He called his mother on Sundays. He had friends he saw infrequently but meaningfully. He was, by most measurable standards, functional. He was also very careful. He'd learned to be. The spaces he allowed were managed relationships at a controlled distance. Connections maintained but not expanded. People let close enough to matter but not so close that losing them would take the floor out from under everything. He'd done the math. After Marcus, he knew what it cost. The mornings with Maya didn't seem to care about any of this. "Your plant's doing better," she said one morning, 3 weeks in, with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of someone whose advice had proven correct. He looked at the basil. It was, in fact, doing better. "Don't be smug about it," he said. "I'm not being smug. I'm making an observation." She poured something into her mug with the focused attention she brought to all coffee-related activities. "You water it too much. By the way, basil doesn't like wet feet. How would you know what basil likes? My mother grew up in Oaxaca. Everything she cooked started with fresh herbs. I've been watering basil since I could reach the kitchen counter." She said it the way she said most things plainly, without performance. Like the information was simply available if he wanted it. He found himself filing it Oaxaca. Mother. Herbs the way he filed details in manuscripts. Pieces of a person that might matter later. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Oaxaca." She thought about this. "I miss the smell of it in summer. And the way my mother's kitchen sounded in the morning." She turned her mug in her hands. "I don't miss enough to leave, but enough to notice the absence." He understood that. The shape of a specific absence, always present in peripheral vision. He almost said so. Instead, he said, "Your spider plant is enormous," and gestured at the radiator. She looked at the plant with genuine warmth. "That's Augusto," she said. "He's been with me for 6 years. You named your spider plant. I name things I intend to keep." She looked at him over the rim of her mug, a brief, direct look, the kind that had a weight to it. Then she looked back at her coffee. "You should name your basil," she said. He looked at the basil. He thought about it. "Harold," he said. She smiled into her mug. He could only tell because of how the corners of her eyes changed. The weeks accumulated. November went gray, and then grayer. Daniel ate lunch at his desk and edited Harmon's second act and found, incrementally, that it was not actually a disaster. It had structure. It had intention. It had been written by someone who understood that the middle of a story was where everything real happened. He wrote 6 pages of notes and emailed them on a Thursday and felt satisfied, which was a feeling he recognized but had been visiting less frequently than before. He still hadn't asked her why she'd climbed through his window. He tried, sometimes, to construct the logical explanation on his own. She'd seen the light off or the lack of it and had some reason to be concerned about a neighbor sitting alone in the dark. But she wasn't that kind of person, the kind who surveilled and intervened. She was direct, not watchful. She didn't seem like someone who acted on vague concern. She seemed like someone who acted when she knew something specific. And she'd come through that window with a specificity about her, the curry, the 2 containers, the basil on the side that suggested intent rather than impulse. He couldn't figure out what she'd known. That was the part he kept returning to. He went to make tea and stood at the stove while the kettle heated and thought about the word absence and how he'd used it. Almost, and hadn't. About the way certain conversations had openings that were too small to walk through, and how he'd spent 3 years being grateful for small openings because large ones were worse. A large opening meant deciding. A small one meant you could stand at the threshold and tell yourself you were still deciding, which was its own kind of staying. Maya didn't do that. She made her statements and left them in the room without tending them, without coming back to check on them. She had said I miss the smell of it in summer and moved directly to his spider plant without waiting to see if he'd match it, without pressing him to offer something equivalent. The information was given freely, without expectation of return. He noticed this because it was unusual. He noticed because he was, professionally and personally, someone who paid attention to what people did with the spaces they left in conversation. She left them open. She never filled them for him. He brought the tea to the desk and opened the Harmon manuscript and read for an hour. The second act was, as he'd told Priya, genuinely good once you stripped the hedging. A woman figuring out that the life she'd arranged around someone else's absence had become its own kind of presence. A structure she'd built so carefully that dismantling it meant not knowing what to build next. He'd read it 3 times now, and each time the same sentence stopped him. A line near the end of chapter 9 that the author had buried in the middle of a paragraph as though she wasn't sure she meant it. She had been so careful for so long that careful had stopped being a choice and become a floor, and she couldn't remember what she'd been standing on before. He put a blank sticky note on the page. Not a comment, just the note, to keep it visible. He worked until the light outside was fully dark and the city had shifted into its evening register. And then he sat for a moment in the quiet. It was a different quiet from October 9th. This one had space in it. Room for something other than what it was containing. He picked up his phone and almost texted her, then stopped. Because they didn't text yet. They existed in a window gap. A fire escape adjacency. A protocol without a name. He put the phone down and went to bed and lay in the dark that was just dark, thinking about second acts. And what happened when you finally trusted the structure that had been there all along. One evening, standing at his bookshelf to return a copy of something he'd been rereading, he noticed the photograph. He stopped. He had, at some point he wasn't sure exactly when, moved it. Not turned it back around. Just moved it from the middle of the shelf to the end. Still face down but shifted. The way you shift a thing without deciding to shift it. He stood and looked at it for a moment. He didn't turn it over, but he stood there long enough that the standing felt like something. He went to make tea. He left the photograph where it was. The opener was a pretext and they both knew it. Maya appeared at the window on a Wednesday evening when the rain was coming down hard enough that the fire escape was invisible beyond 3 feet of wet gray air. She had her jacket on over a work shirt, her hair loose from whatever she'd had it in during the day, and she was holding a bottle of wine in one hand and her own opener in the other. "I need to borrow yours," she said, over the sound of the rain. He looked at the opener in her hand. "You have one," he said. "This one's sticky. I need a different one." She held out the bottle, a red he didn't recognize. The label wine stained at one corner from being stored on its side. "I already have the wine. It would be a shame." He went and got his opener and handed it over. She took it. She looked at the rain. She looked at him. He stepped back from the window and she climbed in. This time she sat on the couch instead of the floor. He got 2 glasses because it seemed like the thing to do, and she opened the bottle with his opener and the superior ease of someone whose hands worked correctly, and she poured them both a measure that suggested they were staying for a while. She had, he noticed, left her shoes by the window. The wine was good. He said so. "My coworker brought it back from a wedding in Napa," she said. "She gave me 2 bottles. I've been saving the second one." She held her glass up slightly, inspecting the color. "It's a Thursday wine. Important distinction. It's Wednesday." which means tomorrow is Thursday, which means you appreciate it tonight with the full knowledge that Thursday is coming. She lowered the glass. That's the whole thing. He thought about that. That's a reasonable framework, he said. I have several. I work in events. She leaned back into the couch with the ease of someone who had decided she was comfortable. The lamp was on. He'd turned it on before she arrived, without consciously planning to. The way certain things now happened without conscious planning. How's the Harmon manuscript? He'd mentioned it once. Through the window. 2 Thursdays ago. She'd remembered. Better, he said. The second act is actually good. The author didn't trust it, and so she'd buried it under hedging. Once you strip the hedging, the structure's there. What's it about? A woman who spends 30 years thinking she's fine with a decision she made at 22, and then has to figure out what to do when she isn't. He paused. There's a house involved, and a sister, and some deferred grief. That's not light reading. No one pays me for light reading. He swirled the wine slightly. It's good. Though, the grief is handled honestly. She doesn't resolve it, she just finds a way to carry it differently. Maya was quiet for a moment. The rain was loud enough to fill the gaps. Which helped. Is that a genre? She said finally. Grief carried differently. It's a subgenre, he said. It shows up everywhere. Most good books have it, even when they're technically about something else. She turned her head slightly to look at him, the way she'd done a few times directly, but not pressingly, leaving him room. Do you read them because of Marcus? She said. He went very still. In the silence, the rain did its work. He looked at the window. He looked at his wine. He understood. In the particular way that understanding sometimes arrived not gradually but all at once. Like a key finding a lock that he had never told her Marcus's name. He had never. In all their window conversation, in one evening of Thai food in the dark. You mentioned his brother to her directly. How do you know that name? He said. She met his eyes. She didn't flinch. Which told him she'd known this moment was coming and had decided to meet it honestly. I heard you, she said. In the hallway. About a month before October. You were on the phone. I came out to check the mail and you were sitting on the floor by your door and you said. She paused, choosing the words carefully. You said it would have been Marcus's birthday, and that you were fine, and that she shouldn't worry. He thought about that phone call. He didn't remember sitting on the floor. He must have slid down the door at some point. The way you did when a conversation ran long and your legs stopped being relevant. I wasn't trying to listen, she said. I got the mail and went back inside. But I heard enough. Enough for what? He said. She held her glass in both hands. She looked at the wine. Enough to know what October 9th probably meant for you, and why, sitting alone in the dark, was... She stopped. Then, more quietly, it was the anniversary, wasn't it? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She didn't push it. She sat with what she'd said and let it exist in the room and didn't try to manage his response to it. Which was, he realized, what she always did. She gave him the information and then let him decide what to do with it. It was a discipline. That restraint. He could tell because he could see the places where she stopped herself from filling the silence. Maya, he said. She looked up. Why didn't you just knock? He said. On the door. Like a normal person. She was quiet for a moment. Because you would have said, you were fine, she said. And you might have said it in a way that made it hard for me to push back. And then I'd be standing in the hallway, and you'd be on the other side of the door, and we'd both be doing the thing where we pretend the situation has been handled. She looked at him directly. The window didn't give you the option of saying you were fine. You were already in the middle of it before you could decide how to respond. He didn't know what to say to that. He looked at the photograph on the shelf, still face down. Still at the end where he'd moved it, and then he looked back at her. And she was watching him with that even, patient expression that was not pity and not performance. It was something simpler than either. It was the look of someone who had decided to be present and was just doing that. You carried Thai food up a fire escape in October, he said. The stairs were wet, she said. It was a whole thing. He almost laughed. He could feel it in his chest, a loosening, something coming up that he hadn't expected. He pressed it back down, but not as hard as he might have. I want to ask you something, he said. Okay. And I need you to actually answer it. She looked at him steadily. Okay, she said again. He opened his mouth. Her phone went off, not a ring but the sustained buzz of an incoming call that didn't stop, the kind that repeated twice. She looked at the screen. The expression that crossed her face was brief but specific, something pulled flat. A professional reflex activating. I have to take this, she said. It's the venue for Saturday. Go, he said. She picked up the call and stood and moved toward the window, her voice shifting into the crisp, competent register she used when she was managing something. He watched her swing one leg out onto the fire escape the way she always did, her free hand finding the railing, her voice unhurried even in the rain. He sat with his wine and the question he hadn't finished asking. She came back in 20 minutes later, rain damp at the shoulders, still wrapping up the call with the clipped, reassuring cadence of someone who had handled the crisis and was now managing the exit. She closed the window behind her. She shook water off her sleeve. She looked at the two glasses, both refilled, and looked at him. Sorry, she said. The florist double-booked the loading dock. Solved. Rescheduled by 40 minutes and nobody's happy but everybody's fine. She sat back down and picked up her glass and looked at him over the rim. You were going to ask me something. He had. In the 20 minutes she'd been on the fire escape, thought carefully about what he was going to do with her name she'd said, with what it meant that she'd said it, with the fact that he wasn't angry and wasn't sure what he was instead. He'd arrived at something that felt less like a question and more like a direction. Not tonight, he said. She paused. Okay. Not because I don't want to ask it. Because I want to ask it when I know what I'm actually asking. He held her gaze. There's a difference between a question and an interrogation. I don't want to interrogate you. Something in her face softened. Briefly. The way it did when she was caught off guard by something she found unexpectedly correct. That's a useful distinction, she said. I edit for a living, he said. I know the difference. She drank her wine. He drank his. The rain was lighter now, tapping rather than hammering, the city settling into its late evening frequency. He looked at the photograph at the end of the shelf, still moved, still not where it had been, and felt, for the first time, that the distance between where it was and where it might end up was not fixed. It was a trajectory, slow, not straight, but pointing somewhere. They finished the wine while the rain finished itself outside, and she gathered her jacket and her own opener and left the way she'd come in through the window. One leg at a time, with the focused competence she brought to every physical task. He watched her go. He sat for a while longer with the empty glasses. Then he got up, crossed to the shelf, picked up the photograph, and put it back in the middle, still face down, but in the middle, closer to where it had started from. Progress, he thought, was rarely linear. It was a series of incremental relocations, each one small enough to seem like nothing until you looked back and couldn't find where you'd started from. He didn't go to Maya with what he'd learned. He went to the facts first, which was how he handled most things that required information before they required courage. He thought about angles. He thought about what she'd said. I came out to check the mail. Their mailboxes were at the end of the hall, near the elevator, and his door was mid-corridor. To get from the elevator to the mailboxes and back, you didn't pass his door. You could only hear someone sitting at his door if you'd stopped at some point between the two. He sat with this for a day. On the second day, he ran into their neighbor from across the hall, an older man named Raymond, who'd lived in the building for 14 years and who had the particular social knowledge of someone who had been observing the same corridor for a very long time. They talked about the boiler, which had been making sounds again. They talked about the mail, which had been delayed for a week. Then Daniel, making his voice casual in the way he made his voice casual when he wanted information he didn't know how to ask for directly, said, "Did Maya move in recently? I keep forgetting how long she's been here." Raymond thought about it. 3, 4 years, he said. Before the Garcias left, she brought cookies when she moved in. Chocolate chip. He nodded with the conviction of someone for whom this detail remained significant. Good ones. And she's around in the evenings usually, Daniel said. I'm trying to coordinate something about the shared bike storage. Raymond shrugged. She keeps odd hours. Events work. But she's around. I've seen her light on at midnight more than once. He paused. She checks on people. Quietly. Brought soup to the Garcias when they had the flu 2 winters ago. Didn't make a thing of it. He pressed the elevator button. Good neighbor, he said, with the finality of the highest available praise. Daniel rode the elevator back up and stood in his apartment and thought about a woman who brought soup and didn't make a thing of it. About a phone call she hadn't meant to hear. About how many times. In October, his light had been off at hours when lights were usually on. She'd been watching. Not in a surveilling way, in the way you watched the things near you. The way you paid quiet attention to the people in your periphery. She'd noticed. And she'd noticed on that specific evening. And she'd done something about it. And she'd carried the decision across a wet fire escape and never once asked him to thank her for it. He knocked on her door on a Friday evening. She answered in 3 seconds. Which meant she'd been near the door. She looked at him, at his face. Specifically, the way she looked when she was reading something. Come in, she said, and stepped back. Her apartment was the mirror of his and nothing like it. The furniture was arranged around a large work table covered in schedules, floor plans, sample menus. There were plants everywhere. Augusto had a whole corner of the kitchen counter, surrounded by what appeared to be cousins and collaborators. Books were stacked on shelves, but also on the floor beside the couch. On the kitchen table, on the arm of a chair that seemed to exist specifically to hold books and nothing else. It smelled like coffee and something herbal and paper. He stood in the middle of it and said, "You didn't check the mail that day." She looked at him carefully. She didn't say anything. "The mailboxes are at the other end of the hall," he said. "You can't hear someone at my door from that direction. You'd have to stop." He paused. "You stopped." She held very still. Not the stillness of someone, caught the stillness of someone who had been waiting for this and had decided how they were going to handle it. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She pressed her lips together for a moment. "Then I'd seen your light off," she said. "Not just that day. A few days before, and the day before, and I'd noticed." She stopped. Started again. "After I heard the call, I was more aware of it. Your window, whether the light was on or off, what time it went dark." She looked at him steadily. "I know how that sounds." "It doesn't sound bad," he said. "It sounds like you were paying attention." "I was worried," she said. "Simply, I didn't have a reason to knock. I didn't have a claim on the information. I was just..." She exhaled slowly. "I was just the person on the other side of the wall who knew, and who kept thinking about what that meant for you." He sat down on the edge of her work table, carefully, not disturbing the floor plans. He looked at the door that led back to the hall, the normal route between their 2 apartments that they had never once used. Then he looked at her. "You said you didn't come because I needed saving," he said. "I didn't." "Then why?" She met his eyes. Her voice was even unhurried, the register she used for true things. "Because sitting alone in the dark on the anniversary of losing someone shouldn't just happen to people without someone noticing," she said. "I noticed, and I could either do something about it or go back to my apartment and know I hadn't." She held his gaze. "That's the whole reason. It's not complicated." He felt something shift in his chest, not the loosening from before. Not the almost laugh. something with more weight to it. Something that had been settled in a particular configuration for 3 years and had just moved, the way tectonic things moved slowly. And then in a way you couldn't undo. You knew, he said. You knew from October 9th. You knew the whole time we were talking through the window. The whole time you were arguing with me about my coffee and telling me to name my basil. Harold, she said softly. You knew the whole time what had brought you through that window and you never said it. You would have managed it, she said. If I'd said it. You would have thanked me and told me it was fine and found a way to make the whole thing reasonable and contained. She looked at him. You do that. You make things reasonable so they can't touch you. The accuracy of it went through him like something sharp and clean. He sat with it. He didn't argue with it. Outside, the city went on at its usual volume. Indifferent. I didn't know what to do with it, he said. Finally, when I found out, I went through the whole logical sequence and he stopped. I was angry for about 4 minutes and then I realized I wasn't. And then I didn't know what to do with that either. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. Maya. She looked at him. He looked at her at the paint on her forearm. That was different paint now. A different color. The orange replaced by something blue-gray. At the steadiness of her eyes. At the way she was standing slightly tensed. Not retreating, but braced. As if she had spent the last few weeks knowing this conversation was coming and had decided she was going to stand in it rather than around it. What were you going to say? He said. That night, when your phone rang, what did you think I was going to ask? She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the radiator clicked on in the background, a gusto swaying slightly in the warm air it produced. I thought you were going to ask why I actually came, she said. Not the food, not the fire escape, the real reason. She paused, and I had decided I was going to tell you. Tell me now, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Because I've seen your light off for 3 Octobers, she said quietly. Not just this one. He went very still. I moved in 4 years ago, she said. That first October, I noticed the window dark. I didn't know you then. I didn't think anything of it except that it was October and the evenings were getting shorter and people turned their lights off. She held her hands loosely at her sides. 2nd October. Same thing. Different quality of dark somehow, I couldn't explain it. I just noticed. 3rd October. I heard the phone call in the hall. She paused. So when the 4th October came, I didn't wait. He sat on the edge of her work table and felt the full weight of that 4 years of October. 4 years of a window going dark in a way she'd noticed and filed and finally decided to act on. He hadn't been invisible, as he'd imagined. He'd been seen by the person 12 feet away, and he hadn't known it. You've been watching out for me, he said, since before I knew your name. I knew your name, she said. It was on the mailbox. A pause. Daniel Reyes. He looked at her. She looked back at him. And something in her expression had shifted. The steadiness was still there but quieter now. The careful composure of someone who had just said a true thing and was waiting to see what it cost. He could see the place where she was holding her breath. I don't know what to do with this, he said. I mean that. I genuinely don't know what the correct next move is. There isn't a correct next move, she said. That's not the kind of thing this is. He nodded. Slowly. He looked at the window across the room, her kitchen window. The one with a gusto on the sill. The one that looked out onto the fire escape. The one she'd passed through to reach him. He looked at the door to the hall. He looked at her. I'm going to go home, he said. She nodded. And I'm going to think about this. Okay, she said. He stood. He walked to her front door, the front door, not the window, and he put his hand on the knob and turned back to look at her one more time. She was standing exactly where he'd left her, near the work table, a gusto visible over her shoulder, her expression open and unhurried and not asking him for anything. Maya, he said. Yeah. He didn't know what he'd meant to say. He stood in the door frame for one more beat. Then he went back to his apartment and stood in the dark for a moment, just to feel the difference between the dark of before and the dark of now, and then he turned on the lamp. He sat on the couch and looked at the photograph on the bookshelf. Still face down, still in the middle of the shelf where he'd moved it back to. He looked at it for a long time without looking away. He didn't have the courage yet for what came after knowing, but he knew what it was. He could feel the shape of it. To the way you felt the shape of a second act problem when you'd finally read closely enough, the structure was there. It had been there. He'd just been reading it from the wrong angle. He woke up on Saturday knowing two things: that he'd slept without lying awake, cataloging reasons to stay where he was, and that he was going to knock on her door. Not climb through a window, not wait for a morning coffee exchange across the fire escape gap, not manage it from the safe distance of a shared sill. He was going to use the hallway, the normal route, the 14 steps between his door and hers, and he was going to do it because that was what you did when you'd finished being careful and were ready to try something else. He made the pour-over coffee first, because some things were now habitual and the habit was the right one. He made 2 cups without deciding to, only noticing when he'd already reached for the second mug. He stood and looked at the 2 mugs and thought, okay. Then he put them on a small tray, because carrying 2 mugs without a tray was a coordination problem he didn't need. He put on actual shoes. He stood at his own door for approximately 15 seconds with his hand on the knob, which was reasonable, because reasonable people took a moment. Then he opened the door and walked the 14 steps and knocked. She opened it in less time than the night before. She was in a faded gray sweatshirt and her hair was down and there was a pencil behind one ear, which meant she'd been at the work table. She looked at the tray. She looked at him. Something in her face did a very small, very controlled thing that he read correctly after 2 months of practice. I made 2, he said. I don't know when I started doing that, but I've been doing it. She looked at the mugs for another moment. Then she stepped back from the door. He walked in and set the tray on the one clear edge of her work table, and she came and stood beside him and they both picked up a mug, and he looked at the floor plans spread across the table, a venue he didn't recognize. Tables numbered and color-coded. A small asterisk next to the stage that he assumed had a meaning she'd remember without writing it down. What's the asterisk? He said. Florist uses that corner for staging, she said. If I don't mark it, someone will try to put a cocktail table there, and then we'll have a whole thing at 6 in the evening when we can't have a whole thing. You prevent problems before they happen, he said. She looked at her coffee. I try to, she said. He turned to look at her. She met his eyes and held them that same steadiness. But different now, because everything was in the open, and steadiness was something she was choosing rather than something she was using as a shield. He could see the difference. He'd had enough time, in the past 18 hours, to read her correctly. 4 Octobers, he said. 4, she confirmed. You were going to tell me that night, he said. Before the venue called, I was going to tell you, she said. And then I thought maybe I should wait until you asked, because you'd asked for an answer and an answer given on your terms would be better than one I gave on mine. She wrapped both hands around the mug. I was still working it out when the call came. I'm asking now, he said, on my terms, specifically and deliberately asking you. She looked at him for a long moment. I noticed you, she said. From the beginning. Not in October before that. Just the fact of you. In the apartment next to mine. This person I'd waved to in the hall, who had a whole life I didn't know about. And then I started to know things slowly. Sideways. The way you know things about people who live close enough to notice. She stopped. And I decided, at some point, that you were someone I wanted to make sure was okay. I didn't have a reason. It wasn't a decision with logic behind it. She looked at him with the directness she reserved for true statements. It was just a fact about how I felt. He put his mug down on the clear edge of the table, carefully. He thought about the last 2 months, the window, The food, in the mornings. The banter. The wine in the rain. The photograph moving incrementally back toward where it had been. He thought about 4 years of October. He thought about a woman who noticed the quality of dark in a neighbor's window and did something about it when the 4th year came. Who climbed a wet fire escape and said, "You'll see," and meant wait. You'll understand it later. When you're ready to. He was ready. He reached out and took the pencil from behind her ear. And she blinked. And he held it up. "You had a pencil," he said. "I know," she said. "I was going to say something meaningful," he said. "But there's a pencil. You can still say the meaningful thing," she said. "I know," he said. He set the pencil down on the table beside his mug. He looked at her eyes, which in the morning light coming through the kitchen window were the kind of dark that resolved clearly, that had warmth in them so specific it felt like a particular color he didn't have a name for yet. "I think I've been reading myself wrong for 3 years," he said. "I was very careful. I thought careful was the same as safe." He paused. "It isn't." She didn't say anything. She just stood and listened. Which was what she did. She let people finish. "I don't know exactly what I'm asking for," he said. "But I know I'm asking for it from you. And I know it involves using the door instead of the window from now on. Because I think I've been going through the window long enough." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face released, not dramatically, not with a visible shift, but the way a room changed when a window was opened. The air moving differently. She stepped forward and took the mug out of his hand and set it down beside the other one. And then she put her hand against his forearm, not his hand. His forearm. "The way you steadied something," and she said, "I've been using the door this whole time. You're just catching up." He put his hand over hers on his forearm. They stood like that for a moment. Outside, the November light was doing its low-angle thing through the kitchen window, catching the edge of Augusto's leaves and the rim of both mugs and the side of her face in a way that would have been cinematic if either of them had been paying attention to that. They weren't. They were paying attention to the hand on the arm and what it cost to stay there and the fact that it didn't cost as much as he'd budgeted for. "Harold is doing well," she said, against the quiet. "Harold is doing extremely well," he agreed. She laughed, a real one, not the contained versions she usually allowed herself, and he felt it in his chest like a key finding a lock. The good kind of understanding. The kind that arrived and stayed. The plans they made afterward were simple dinner. His door. Saturday evening. She would bring the wine because she already knew which one. He would cook because he'd told her he could, and now had to demonstrate this under actual conditions. It was, by any reasonable metric, a small thing. He was aware of this. He was also aware that small things, in his recent experience, he had a tendency to be the load-bearing ones, the ones that held the structure up while the larger things were still being figured out. He spent the afternoon cleaning his apartment with actual intention rather than maintenance. He moved things. He made decisions about surfaces. He stood in front of the bookshelf and considered its arrangement with the critical eye he usually reserved for manuscript structure, and made 3 small adjustments he couldn't quite articulate the logic of, except that they felt right in the way editorial instincts felt right, not provable, but trustworthy. He cooked something that required attention at the right moments and timing across multiple elements. The kind of thing that gave you something to do with your hands when you were otherwise too aware of yourself. He had music on. He hadn't had music on in the apartment in a while. He noticed this without making anything of it, which was itself a kind of progress. When she knocked at 6 in the evening, he opened the door in 3 seconds, which was less time than was strictly necessary. She stood in the hallway with a bottle of wine and her jacket and a look of entirely contained amusement. "You live here?" she said. "I do," he said. "I've never knocked on this door before." "I know. It's strange," she said. "In a good way." He stepped back from the door. She walked in through the front door, which had a deadbolt and a chain and a secondary lock he'd installed after a bad week 2 winters ago. She walked through all of that. past all of it, into the apartment, and stood in the middle of it, and looked around the way you looked at a place you'd seen from one angle and were now seeing from another. He watched her take in the bookshelf, the photograph, visible now, right side up, center of the second shelf. Marcus grinning in the orange jacket. She saw it. She didn't say anything about it. She just looked. And then she looked at him. And the look was the full weight of everything she understood without needing to say. Something smells good, she said. Timing's critical for the next 4 minutes. He said, make yourself at home. She set the wine on the counter and did exactly that, moving through his apartment with the ease of someone who had always been comfortable in spaces that weren't hers. And he went back to the stove and paid attention to the timing. They ate at the kitchen table, which he'd cleared for the occasion in a way that suggested both care and the attempt to look like he hadn't thought about it. She noticed, he could tell, and didn't mention it, which he appreciated in the specific way you appreciated someone reading a room correctly. She had seconds, which was its own form of verdict. The conversation moved the way their conversations had always moved, a statement. A pause. A question that wasn't quite a question. A space left open for whoever wanted to fill it. The same language. Different setting. His door instead of the window. The lamp on from the beginning. Not turned on in the middle of something. At some point, she looked at the photograph from across the room and then looked at him. He looks like someone who argued about everything, she said. He did, Daniel said. He was usually right, which made it worse. What was he usually right about? Daniel thought about it, that things were better shared. He said, he had a whole philosophy. I thought it was annoying for 29 years. He looked at the photograph. He wasn't wrong. She held her wine glass and didn't say anything, because she understood, as she always understood, that some things were complete without a response. He looked at her across the table at the easiness of her in his space, the way she sat with the unself-conscious comfort of someone who had decided to be somewhere and was simply there and thought that the word earned was the right one for this. Not the evening specifically. The capacity for it. The willingness to be in it. That had been earned. Incrementally, through every small decision he'd made in the past 2 months to stay with something instead of managing it from a distance. Later, after she'd gone home, and they'd made a plan for the following week that was already different in quality from any plan he'd made in a while, more specific. Less tentative. The kind of plan that assumed its own future. Daniel stood at his bookshelf one final time. He stood the way he'd stood in front of it all the times before. The standing that felt like something without being anything specific. He put his hand on the photograph. He looked at Marcus, grinning in the orange jacket, wind-burned and entirely himself. He thought about the way some absences didn't get smaller, they just became something you learned to carry at a different angle, until the carrying was part of you and not just a weight. He put the photograph back in the center of the shelf, right side up, where it could be seen from the room. He left the lamp on. Across the shared wall he could hear Maya's music, something low and instrumental that she played when she was working, that he'd heard enough times now to know it meant she was in the good part of a problem. The part where the solution was visible if you looked at the right angle. He listened to it for a minute. Then he went to the window, his window, the broken latch one that faced the fire escape, and looked out. Her kitchen light was on. He could see Augusto on the radiator, the big impressive plant she'd carried for 6 years and named because she named things she intended to keep. He looked at the window for a moment. He didn't climb through it. He just looked, and felt the particular warmth of knowing that what was on the other side of the wall was not something he had to manage from a distance anymore. Some love doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come through the front door with a declaration and a plan. It comes through the window in October, with green curry and basil on the side. And it says, "You'll see," and it means exactly what it says. If you can stop asking why long enough to find out.